Hey, you're tuned in to today's Live at 5. Before we jump into today's episode, I just want to remind you that this show is only possible because of the continued support of amazing people like you. You can continue to support us by subscribing to this YouTube channel, sharing an episode with a friend, or signing up to our Patreon page via the link in the description below. From there, you'll be able to access some exclusive bonus content and dive deeper into the world of Live at 5. Now, without any further ado, let's get right into today's show. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to Live at 5 this Friday, May 15th, and we are joined by a very good friend and supporter of Kansas Smitty's, who has a great story for us today for this Archive at 5. We call Tom Frederikse Coach Tom because he never ceases to give us some very inspiring advice to go out there and get them whenever we go to see him. So it's great to see him on Zoom, and he has a great story for us today about when he saw Count Basie in the 70s. Did you grow up in Maryland, Tom?
Yeah, just outside of Washington, D.C.
Okay, right. So you told me this story once, but just for the people out there, I want to hear it again because I love it. So go for it.
All right. Well, the story is about my dad, really. And my dad grew up in Holland. And can you believe he was 18 in 1938 when 1 O'Clock Jump was released? Wow. And he was a jazz fan. And he tried to hear what he could. But shortly after that release of 1 O'Clock Jump, obviously the occupation started in Holland. And he was in a sort of huge lockdown for 5 years in Holland. No jazz music, no nothing, of course. And then for 5 years after the war, he did manage to get to London a little bit. So he saw some British jazz, and I guess there must have been some American jazz there. But then he finally went to the US, permanently immigrated to the US, immigrated in 1950. And then the world of American jazz opened up to him with the radio and being able to get vinyl and all the rest. And he saw some amazing gigs. One pops into mind. He saw Satchmo in 1965 in Washington, wow. D.C.
The golden age.
Yeah. But then the 70s came, and that was a really difficult time for jazz and for a lot of music that wasn't rock and roll. There are a lot of stories about James Brown not being able to get a gig in the 70s, and there are certainly a lot of stories about jazz legends not being able to get much outside of Los Angeles in the 70s. And Count Basie was one of those. And my dad wanted to bring me to see these jazz bands. So when I was 15, he said, Count Basie's coming to town, but it's going to be a little bit different because he's not carrying the power to attract audiences the way he used to. So he was actually playing in a high school auditorium just outside of Washington, D.C. I think probably capacity was about 300, and it did not sell out.
Jeez. That. Isn't that amazing?
It is, yeah. And the stage was sort of lowish, and it was right in front of us, so we were quite close. But the other astonishing thing about it is that in 1979, I had a habit of carrying with me everywhere I went my huge music system, which was this big red Panasonic thing. I think it took 10 of those giant D-sized batteries.
You were like the guy from Do the Right Thing. Fight the power.
Exactly. I was Radio Rakim. I was. And I did that. I sort of turned on tunes wherever I went and made instant party.
That's great.
But the weird thing is that we showed up to the gig at Gaithersburg High School, and I was carrying my huge Radio Rakim red thing, and nobody batted an eyelid. Not a word. I just carried it right into the gig.
Right.
And this thing is as big as I was at the time.
I love it.
Right? This huge thing. And we went to our seats. I had an aisle seat. I put the thing down next to me on the floor. It had 2 cassettes in there, and one of them was blank. So I just hit records and recorded the whole show. Pretty reasonable quality for considering that it was a box on the floor.
Yeah.
And Count Basie played an amazing show. It was fantastic. He was on form. He was having fun. And I don't know what his attitude would have been there. I think he was about 73, 74 at the time. I guess he'd had a few years of it being difficult to tour, so he was used to that by that point. But the music was absolutely fantastic. It blew me away. And at the end of the gig, he actually finished the gig after a lot of applause, and then said, "If you want to come up and say hi, then do." And
Wow.
half the audience left, and about 100 people lined up, and we all had a couple of minutes to say hello, and we waited an hour or two or whatever. But I shook his hands, and Freddie Green was right next to him, and I had a
Wow.
look at his guitar, and I was a piano player at the time, but I was learning guitar. And the thing that I remember really, really well is I looked at Freddie's guitar that was lying on the seat next to him, and the action on the guitar was really, really, really high.
Right. Okay.
And I thought, you can't play like that. How do you play like that? And so I, after saying hello to Count Basie, I looked next to him and said, "Can I ask you a question to Freddie Green? How can you play, or why do you play with your action so high?" I thought that the great idea was low action makes it easy to play. Why is it so high? He said, "Otherwise, I'd never be heard."
Wow.
So that
From the
was
horse's
apparently,
mouth. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, apparently. I wonder how much of that difference it makes, but apparently enough that he was willing to suffer the high action in order to be heard, and that was enough.
Well,
So
that's
was,
so great. And it's,
yeah,
it's the thing that you said, I mean, the difference between the musical landscape when Basie was kind of coming up in 36, 38, 35, he took over the Benny Moten band. It reminds me of, I have a similar story, but it wasn't, I think the cool thing about your story is that you went to see the band and they sounded good, because I went to see Maynard Ferguson at Greenwich, not Greenwich, Greenwich High School when I was 15. And Maynard Ferguson had a really good time in the 70s. And let me tell you, by the time 2000 rolled around, he was not having a good time. And the thing that I love about this set, and I can, agree with you, because I've listened to the set that you sent through, which for those of you listening, we are going to play you the tape after this. So don't feel like this is just a speech with no reward. But I mean, the cool thing is that Basie was able to keep that standard going for 40 years, and he was alive into the 80s and still playing. But the thing I love about your recording, and before we came on today, you said, well, it's not the best quality, but it's good. And I really enjoy the quality of it, because I was listening to this podcast, Ways of Hearing. I don't know if you've heard of it. Darcy, I know I sent it through to you, and we talked about it the other day, but I was listening to the episode about noise, and it's this presenter who's talking about the switch from analog to digital. And he's talking about the difference between what we perceive as signal and what we perceive as noise. And actually, to have, you look at something like Pet Sounds, or something that's completely textured and layered, the Beach Boys album.
sure.
And Brian Wilson was trying to emulate the Phil Spector, wall of sound thing, which is basically, there's a lot of noise incurred in that. And the reason for the noise is that noise gives us atmosphere, right? And you listen to Basie's studio recordings in the 70s, and they have less noise than the stuff from the 60s, the 50s. And what I love about your tape is that it's late 70s, but he's playing all the tunes from the 50s and 60s.
Yes.
And they have noise, they have atmosphere, they have this kind of real life to them. And you think, wow, the band actually didn't sound all that different 20 years later.
Yeah.
So I love that,
Yeah, and it's got a playful thing to it as well. They clearly are not taking themselves very seriously and having some fun. And I guess that's just who they were. They're great players, and they could afford to relax while they played. But I also wonder if it didn't come from having toured relentlessly for such a long time that they needed to have fun in order to keep it good.
Yeah, yeah. So a little bit about you. I mean, how did this I didn't realize that you were a jazz head so young, and I didn't realize that your dad had that kind of influence on you, because I of course know you as a jazz fan now, but you did a lot in music outside of jazz. So how did that early stuff kind of guide your musical path?
Well, I mean, my dad was a jazz guy, so I did listen to he listened to stuff that you don't hear that much these days, like the early Lou Rawls was a big thing for him. And the first 2 or 3 albums of Lou Rawls, I think, are amazing. And then he turned into that slick Las Vegas thing that I don't like quite as much.
Right.
So he had some bits that I think I was taken by the idea that nobody else I knew was aware of this stuff. You know, by that point, if you said Lou Rawls, everybody has thought of the big hit, Let There Be Love or whatever. But the first 2 albums were really cool. And then, of course, the 40s swing thing was my dad's main thing. So I was brought up listening to a lot of, I mean, some trad stuff, a lot of Glenn Miller, a lot of Benny Goodman, but also a little bit more deep catalog on Count Basie and that sort of thing. So that was really cool to me. And I think he stopped listening to new stuff pretty early on. So it was all old. And by the time we got to the 70s, he didn't really listen to anything that was recorded after 1970. So it was an old.
There was a line. But then you've been in the direction of electronic music and DJ culture, and you've also you play classical music as well. So those things had to come into the mix at some point as well.
Yeah. Well, they already were.
Oh, they already were. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in 1979, I was actually already in a band, and I think it was just the end of 1979 when I made my first record. When we went into a 16-track studio and cut a 7-inch record with my band, which was so exciting at the time. It was the best you could do. And then 2 years later, when I was 17, I was a T-boy at a studio in Washington, D.C. called No Evil. And that started my life in the studio, and I stayed there for the next 18 years, really, without coming out. And having traveled around, I was at Universal Studios in Chicago for a long time. Spent some time in New York at studios like Green Street. In the middle of it, I did spend some time going to Indiana University as a music student, but never really went to class. I mostly was in a band and playing and recording. And then came to London in 1985 and was an engineer at Abbey Road. So I know the big studio life pretty well.
Wow. Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's so cool to hear that, and to hear this kind of early piece of this. It's such a great document that you have from both your early life and also for all of us, just to hear this little slice of cool history. So thanks a lot. Yeah.
Hey, my pleasure.
Tell me, what were you going to say?
I was going to say the noise that you mentioned was, I think, something that I subliminally was thinking, because having worked at Universal Studios that typically had live bands or orchestras that were huge, Abbey Road that always had big bands, I definitely was around that big live recording thing that had the noise, that had the live, that had the spontaneity, or at least had the feeling that everyone had.
What do you think about that development of, kind of, analog to digital, not so much for the technology, but for the sonic experience? Like, it's changed so much. Do you kind of think back on those times as nostalgic, or do you?
Well, it happened early though, didn't it? I mean, the live thing that I was sort of reacting against Steely Dan and all of those tight, perfect acts, and I loved the feeling of live. And actually, that's why I sort of finished my recording career at the turn of the century, because that's when the idea of a bunch of guys in a room going for it until they get it right stopped, right? Because in my recording world was all about, you had a certain amount of time, you had to finish within that time. If you didn't, then you weren't making records. And if you did, if you got it in 24 hours, that's the records. You couldn't go back and fix it again. You could mix a little bit, but you couldn't really, you couldn't fix problems that were big. So I liked the adrenaline and the excitement of, you've got to get it right now, otherwise forget it. And by around 2000, that stopped being such an important part of the recording industry. So I think this live thing and the noise thing you're talking about is me.
That's great. That's great. Well, Coach Tom, always a pleasure. We're going to jump into the archive at 5 today, and tomorrow we're going to be playing Tom's Basie concert from, what did you say, 1978, 79?
79.
79.
1979, yeah.
The golden year. So thanks again for listening to Live at 5 and to Archive at 5. Remember to subscribe to this YouTube channel and to check the links in our description below for ways you can get involved with us and with our Live at 5 broadcasts. So without further ado, we're going to jump into some Count Basie Orchestra.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Time for a Tipple with me, Alex Honey Bolton, as your host. Today we're going to be talking about and making the gimlet. Now, the gimlet in the early 20th century was supposedly a way for naval sailors to combat scurvy by the intake of lime. So that's their excuse and they're sticking with it. So let's just roll with that. First off, you're going to need some gin, London Dry, some sugar syrup. So I've just made mine 2 parts sugar to 1 part water on the stove. Boil it down to dissolve all the sugar, and then finally limes. As always, we're going to be chilling our glass while we're preparing this drink. So this is a shaken drink. We're going to need a Boston shaker. I'm also going to be using a muddler to juice the limes in the glass, and then also strainers. We'll take a fresh lime, slice it, and I'm going to just cut off a wheel for use for a garnish later. You just want 30 milliliters or 1 ounce of lime juice, but I like to shake it with the full lime. And these limes are looking about juicy enough for 30 ml, so I'm going to go ahead and put those in there, along with 15 milliliters, half an ounce of sugar syrup. And then we want 60 ml or 2 ounces of London Dry gin. Muddle that in. This is just going to juice the limes. So an easy way to remember the ingredients of this drink, you're going to want 60 ml of gin, half of that amount of lime, and then half of that amount again of sugar syrup. And then it's an easy formula. So to shake the drink, you're going to want to crack some ice in there to dilute it. And then give it a shake. Can take our chilled glass out of the refrigerator. Serve up like so. Cut a lime, the wedge in it. You can place that over the side. And there, incredibly easy, fresh gimlet. So let's give that a try. Too easy to drink. I love it. Incredibly Moorish and refreshing. This one's a little tart, which is what I'm into, to be honest. I don't like it too sickly sweet, like something you might get using a lime cordial, so it's lovely with fresh limes. Yeah, I just want to keep drinking it. And that's what I'll do, fight off the scurvy. Hey, well, I hope you enjoy if you've been making one of these at home, and I'll see you on next week's edition of Time for a Tipple. Ciao.
Thanks again for listening to Live at 5. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date with every episode. You can also click on the link in the description below to sign up to our Patreon and find out where you can sign up for Kansas Smitty's memberships, as well as purchase records and merch. Enjoy your evening, and we'll see you tomorrow, Live at 5.